A lot of times we're going to relate to a company as a organizational chart, which is naturally hierarchical. There's the CEO sits at the top. There's the executive team that works for her. Then there's the people that work for the executive team. Those are usually different departments, and then it goes into teams inside of those departments. And it's a matrix organization, and that is great to have a strong, clear set of accountabilities. It's very important, and it's very clear who's doing what, and that you see the decision-making hierarchy. That's very, very important. But culture doesn't quite work like that. Decision-making works like that, but culture itself is something different. Culture works more like a nucleus with electrons orbiting around it. So if you think of the sun and the planets orbiting around it, if you think of a atom, and there's a nucleus at the center of the atom and then electrons orbiting around it, that's probably a more realistic metaphor of how culture works, because culture is a more organic system than you can just paint in a hierarchical structure. So if you see that nuclear model of culture as allowing for the culture to grow organically, you can see that the CEO is first and foremost accountable to the success of that culture, because they are the nucleus of the entire company. The executive team is a lot like those electrons orbiting around the nucleus. When a CEO has certain values, personal values that they live by, those values become embodied by the team. Likewise, if a CEO espouses values and talks about how important it is to care about people, how important it is that we're living with integrity, but doesn't live those, doesn't matter what they say are their values, the team starts to modify and adapt to working with that person's way of being, not what they say they're going to do. So you can see this when a company switches the CEO. There's this awkward period for an amount of time where everyone has to kind of reorganize and get to know the new way of doing things. And that's often a reflection, not just of what that CEO says, but who they are. What they hold dear to them is going to start to influence the way the executive team around them starts to work, how they make requests, how the CEO makes requests, how she leads her team is going to change the culture of that executive team. So now that you've got the nucleus has changed, the orbit starts to change. And then as that spreads out into the organization, the way that those executives are now leading their departments is starting to change. So there's a whole new culture that forms around a CEO if they've changed the CEO. And you can hire all of the cultural experts in the world, and nothing will change your culture more than changing your CEO. And it's a observable phenomenon. And so if that's the case, you cannot outsource your culture. You can put people in place who might be head of culture, who might be head of people. That's very important. But you as a CEO are accountable for that culture, because it's an expression of who you are on the inside. The reason why this is so exciting is that gives you a lot of capability as the CEO to build the culture that you want, to create the culture that you want in partnership with every single person who works with you. And that requires quite a bit of self-awareness on the part of the CEO, because not only are your strengths, your values, your principles alive, your weaknesses, your blind spots, your deficiencies will also start to show up in a culture. A CEO who's very outgoing, very connected with people, but sometimes uncomfortable with processes and procedures, that culture will start to reflect the discomfort with processes and procedures, confusion around that stuff. Likewise, if someone's very process and procedure oriented, their team is going to start to over tilt to the direction of process and procedures and potentially forget the connection, the human side. So it gives a lot of potential for a CEO to begin to do self-awareness exercises and grow from the inside out the culture they want. And it starts with them.